Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome y'all to the House Public Safety Homeland Security meeting. We've got three bills on the agenda today. And I guess for the benefit of those who weren't at the first meeting, if I'll start down on the right with Ms. Taylor and let her identify herself, and this may be the last time we do this, for the benefit of folks who hadn't been to this meeting before. Darlene?
I represent Thomas, Grady, and Decatur County. Was that loud enough?
Yes.
I'm Gerald Crane, and I represent 9 counties in southwest Georgia.
I'm Bill Hitchens, and I represent House District 161, which is the southern part of Effingham County and the western part of Chatham County.
Micah Gravely, I represent Douglas and Paulding County, District 67.
Bill Werkheiser, District 157, which is Tattnall, Evans, and Wayne counties.
Jay Collins, House District 68. I represent Douglas and Carroll County.
Eddie Lumsden, District 12. I represent Floyd and Chattooga counties.
Mike Glanton, I represent District 75, Clayton County.
Keisha Waits, I represent Fulton County and Clayton County.
Mac Jackson, I represent District 128, which is in East Central Georgia, and I have 7 counties.
I'm Scott Holcomb, State Representative for District 81, which is mostly DeKalb and some of Gwinnett.
Representative Gloria Frazier, District 126, Richmond and Burke counties.
I'm Alan Powell from Hartwell, Georgia. I represent Hart, Franklin, and Madison counties. And I want to welcome y'all today. First order of business, Representative Fry. Representative Fry here. Is there any of the members of the subcommittee that wishes to explain his bill? The crosswalk bill?
Mr. Chairman, having just come on this committee, this was one of the bills that I really showed favor towards. Right now, the way that the law is written, if you're walking on a sidewalk, approaching a crosswalk, you have to actually step out into the crosswalk in order for the cars to stop. And what this bill does is just clarifies some language and allow and codifies some of the things that we want to do to improve the public safety as far as pedestrians crossing the road. If you'll read there in section 1 of the bill, lines 12 through 17 are some new language that will be put in to law. And also, if you'll look on lines 28 through 36, it's my understanding that this bill has passed this committee and was passed by the House last year, but that it died over in the Senate before sine die. And so I think this would be a good bill for us to show favor towards.
Very good. You did pretty good for a freshman. Very good. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, y'all may remember this bill. We did it for the last 2 years. It was under my name at that time. And everything that Representative Collins said is what it is. This is the same bill that passed the House last year, went to the Senate, died on the 40th night because it wasn't put, or because the senator didn't know how to explain it. Quite frankly, what it really does is, as Representative Collins had said, but right now the lighted crosswalks, there's nowhere in code that recognizes them, and this recognizes these diode lighted crosswalks. And we're going to do Representative Fry a favor, and we're going to entertain a motion if there's no questions.
Mr. Chairman, I did the do pass this morning. I'd like to do likewise this afternoon. Do pass. Motion do pass. LC 391492. That's what we're looking.
LC 391492.
Motion do pass.
Do we have a second? Do we have any questions from any of the committee members? Do we have anyone out in the audience that wishes to be heard on this issue? If not, we have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye. Aye. Ayes have it. All right, Mr. Elam. I know how you feel.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, I appreciate you all having me come before you. I have a bill that I'm personally concerned about from my personal experience. It's gone through some changes, so I would like to document that it's LC 411023 ERS is the one we're looking at now. Having gone through two personal terrible storms in my district, where I was directly affected. The first storm put two huge trees on my oldest daughter's home, and the last one did tremendous damage to my own property, my son's house. It basically ripped the roof off, and my daughter, a lot of damage. I was immediately involved in working with volunteers. What this bill is asking us to do is to allow volunteers who are working under the auspice of the governor's declared state of emergency and working directly under the control of the Emergency Operating Center, that those volunteers, in the process of their duties, could go on private property. And the example where I was dealing with is like power lines along houses and property. And obviously, almost all of the time, that power line is right on the property line. So literally, you step past the power line, you're on private property. You stay on the public side, then you're on public property. We had concerns where people just, they didn't want to go on private people's property because they felt like that they wouldn't want them to. So this would codify that they can do that as long as the person is concerned, the person is doing the things in accordance with the emergency declared by the governor and by the EOC. Now, one point I'd like to cover now that was brought up in the subcommittee is to the liability portion. If you are an official volunteer, it's already covered, and the actual code section is 38-3-32, 33, and 35, which liability you already covered as far as liability is concerned. It's just this special authorization where you as a volunteer being allowed to go on the private property, that is not codified. So the liability portion, once we would approve them, if this bill approves a volunteer to, in the process of their duties, go on public and private property, then the liability issue is already covered. They would come under that part of the statute already written. I would now stand for questions. If there are questions, I'll be glad to discuss those. And Mr. Chairman, as I talked with you earlier, Gima would like to speak with me about the bill. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, the posture of this bill is that while originally we had brought this up to be voted on this afternoon, Gima has had some questions that they wanted to discuss with the author. So I told him that we're going to hold this bill, but for the sake of any inquiries out there, any questions and commentary, we'll go ahead and take testimony on that. Mr. Clanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Representative, is it not true that a property owner at any time that he or she deems necessary can ask you not to come on their property or to leave their property? Is it not true?
Ms. Clanton, I really, really appreciate you bringing that up, because that was a major change, the first change that I wanted to make in it. I'm a strong private property advocate, and so the bill in the last 3 or 4 lines definitely says that unequivocally, if that property owner says that you cannot come on their private property, then you can't. And to the great extent possible, I'd be glad to read that portion if you would like me to, or each member can read it. Okay. Okay, let's go to line 21, that such emergency responders shall make reasonable efforts to conduct such duties without interfering with the rights of private property owners, and shall cooperate with such private property owners to the greatest extent practicable. That's the exact wording.
More questions?
No, sir.
Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative, a couple things real quick. That line that you just referenced, this wasn't my initial question, but real quick, if we could double back on that. The end of that, greatest extent practicable, and where you started reading on line 21, that shows a good faith on behalf of the government, but still, in my reading of that, an emergency responder who might not just be EMS or fire service going to help neutralize power lines. In your initial example, it still seems a little vague to me that the emergency responders in that instance could still stay on the property with the homeowner or property owner saying you need to leave. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I specifically discussed this in depth with the attorney that helped me draft it. He said if we went too much further, you're completely gutting the bill completely. I would surely be open to any changes, because I truly, if that private property owner does not want those volunteers to be on that property, I surely wouldn't want us to agree that they could do that. In the cases where I was involved, the private property owners were begging us to come on, begging us to help. And as an example that I gave in the subcommittee, if you ever played pickup sticks, if you could imagine playing pickup sticks, except instead of tiny sticks, trees that you can't reach around, 150 feet tall, literally just crossed. There's no way. My son lived on the backside of Radium Springs subdivision. It took him 2 hours to go a half a mile, over. And here we were, there was about 100 of us out there trying to help. It was like a war zone. So any suggestions, Mr. Chairman, that you all would make to make that clear? I do not want my bill to any way encroach on a private citizen if they don't want those volunteers on their property.
Thank you, Representative. One follow-up, if I could, that's kind of unrelated, but that addresses what you mentioned earlier, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind follow-up. When you mentioned the issue with down power lines, I believe you alluded to that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in most cases, I know Carroll EMC, who serves my area, and Georgia Power as well, a lot of times they have a 15-foot easement on either side of their line, even on private property. So if there was an issue there, then they could access that, as well as the fire service or whomever else was taking care of that. So wouldn't that cover that issue?
These trees are 100, 150 feet tall. And when they're crossing, literally when they've got these power lines, just miles of power lines down. So these trees are on public and private property. That easement, that wouldn't be near enough to get back to cover all of the private property that you would need to get onto to properly clear an area. You just...
Sure, but your bill deals with the instance of a state of emergency and then allowing the government essentially to come on private property to address an issue. So my only concern, this will be my last.
The government can already.
Right, yes, sir. I served a little time in law enforcement myself, so I'm aware of right when you can and can't go on property, and I get that you're trying to help out, and I appreciate that. My only concern is through some of the definition, you have debris removal, restoration of services, infrastructure repair, things like that. Oftentimes are going to be the power service taking care of a lot of that, unless there's an instance where fire or police need to come help for an individual's safety, in which case they're coming anyway.
Right.
So My concern is us opening up this code section and it being written too broad, and I'm willing to work with you in this committee to try to get some language to tighten some of this, but my concern as it stands right now is this is wide open. Even though I appreciate your attempts to try to, through line 21 through 23, that's concerning to me. But thank you anyway for your answers.
Okay, maybe I just quickly follow up. Your emergency responders, they can't anyway. This is strictly for volunteers. An emergency responder, during a state of emergency, there's already a law that allows them to go on the private property. So we're not talking about any type of police or emergency or fire or anyone like that.
Right, but these people now are coming as under the direction of the federal, state, or local government. So they're coming with whether they're volunteers or whatever example you want to use or come up with, they're coming as a hand of the law, essentially. So we have to be, I think, very, very careful in how we do that. And like I mentioned, I look forward to working with you and the rest of the committee to work this out.
Well, I tell you what, y'all seem to have brought up several of them. Ms. Waits, did you have your light on?
I did, and it was specific to volunteers, but I did want to make one point if I may.
All right.
Okay, as an emergency manager that served on 27 federal disasters, this is one of the biggest issues that we deal with is going on private property. And so I see a need for the bill, but I do echo the member's sentiments in terms of the rights of the property owner to refuse entry. So my thought is if we can clean that language up there in 2122, I don't see any reason why we can't move it today.
We'll be more than glad to let you work with the author after Mr. Bryson that Jim has talked to.
That'd be huge. Yeah, that'd be great.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just maybe to answer some, or not maybe to answer some questions, but it's a question probably for Julius from a council perspective on lines 21, provided, however, that such emergency responder shall make reasonable efforts to conduct. What's the standard? What would be above reasonable effort? What would be below reasonable effort? From if you've and let me kind of, you've got gross negligence, ordinary care. What would the standard in this situation be? Simple negligence. Is there I guess make reasonable efforts. What are we legally speaking there from a liability perspective?
I don't think there is a standard in
A
terms
below or
of
below
entering the property. I'm not aware that there is a standard.
Okay.
That's been set.
All right, if I may follow up, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
From an insurance perspective, and we've probably got some folks here in the crowd that may want to address that. If you have, let's say, a church volunteer,
That's the case we had.
in this case, we had a church volunteer, or in any case, who comes onto a property, and I'm gonna make up an example, with a chainsaw trying to move debris, and a tree dislodges and falls onto the house. Is that situation, is there going to be an insurance issue in that situation of, is it going to be covered? Well, it wasn't the local, it wasn't the power company, it wasn't the federal government, it was a volunteer associated with a church. They come onto the property, or would that fall under, do you foresee any insurance claims problems in that area?
Once the volunteers come under, and they're approved, then they would come under the statute that already exists.
So they'd be covered,
That's correct.
as well as the property owner's property?
Yes. As the attorney who drafted this with me, there is a statute already right now in place. And it actually is 3 sections, 38-332, 38-333, and 38-335. And I'll be glad to read what he gave me if you'd like. But the liability for those who are already authorized to be there in a state of emergency exists under this statute.
So it would extend to those that have been given charge, I guess?
Once the volunteer has been brought under this umbrella, then they would be given this same liability
protection.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
Okay. No more. Thank you.
Mr. Clanton?
No,
You waived? All right. Do we have anyone that wishes it to be heard on this issue today? If not, then at the wishes of the author, we're going to hold action on this bill until you can talk with Gemma. I would suggest you've got a couple of folks here that want to work with you.
Yes, sir.
And I'm sure that they're going to offer their advice to it. Mr. Cook, be careful what you ask, you're going to get it. So. But thank you for being here today.
Thank you, sir.
All right, have we got a substitute to 149? Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, while they're passing this out, you should be getting a substitute LC 411024S. This bill was heard in the subcommittee this morning. We'll give a little bit of a background to this bill. Last session, there was an investigative report about an industry in Georgia that, quite frankly, I didn't even have a clue existed. You know, service in the legislature, you find new issues all the time, and this dealt with crime scene cleanup or trauma cleanup, the people that offer their services to clean up houses after an unfortunate suicide or a murder event or something like that. And in the context of the investigative report, apparently some company was putting pictures on the internet, which was, quite frankly, sort of a, I guess it goes overboard to say that type of rude behavior is just out of context. But we realized at this point that nobody regulated these folks. To me, the bigger concern I had wasn't just rudeness, but was the possibility of criminal intent, that when people open up their homes to companies to come in and do these trauma scene cleanups, they basically walk out and let them do it because nobody wants to be there in person when they're doing it. So that gives these folks complete availability to the people's property, their possessions, and everything else. Not including the fact that there was possible referrals that was going on in this business. So we had decided at that time we needed to do either registration or full-born licensing out of this. And the product that you see in this substitute today is an ongoing process of this. The general intent of this legislation is to say that anyone who offers their services as a publicly as a company doing this type of cleanup, that they'll register with the GBI, they'll pay a fee, they'll have a background check. The principals will be the one that are responsible to be a non-felon, and does not affect their employees. The principal of the company will be responsible for the actions of their employees, as well as any 1099 or subcontracting and the cleaning up. That they maintain $1 million worth of insurance, that they have a $100,000 surety bond, that they basically put in writing the services that they're going to render, and that they dispose of. And quite frankly, that was the biggest, probably one of the biggest draw card that drew in all the other folks, and that's how to dispose of the biohazardous waste properly. And quite frankly, that's been all narrowed down so that the folks who thought that they were going to be involved or may have accidentally been drug in have been taken out. It does not say that if you as a citizen that you want to do your own cleanup, or your neighbor or your nephew or somebody comes over to help if they want to do it, that's your private property rights still are maintained. Does not affect businesses that fall under OSHA regulations because they're already covered for the cleanup and the disposal of biohazardous waste. Ladies and gentlemen, that's generally what this does, and I'll be glad to stand for questions. Or there's some people here that are probably more knowledgeable. I see some of them in attendance today. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Where in the bill does it talk about the privacy part of, for the victim? I know you're talking about parts and a crime scene, but where does it say in here is that they can't put this on any type of social media?
Rules and regulations that'll be formulated by the GBI
Okay.
and in the written contract.
And so even in a cleanup effort, there wouldn't be any body parts left, would it? I mean, you have that on here.
You know, quite frankly, this has been a most distasteful bill for me to have to deal with, about how to describe biohazard and all of that. You know, and all of that was added in, and most of it's been stricken out now. But it's basically the interpretation of the biohazardous waste, that it be disposed of according to EPD rules and regs is what we're trying to get to.
Except T.
And Mr. Collins may be able to give that answer to you a little bit better.
This is a very sensitive subject, and so I just want to speak to some of the knowledge I have on this issue. You know, a lot of times when you have trauma, you have a murder or suicide, especially with gunshot. You know, any of those fragments that are left over from that gunshot, that has to be disposed of. So this bill will help address that, to make sure that the people that are going in and doing that are doing it in a respectable manner. They're being sensitive to the situation, and they're disposing of that properly. What you don't want to have is someone who shows up with a case of gloves and a trash bag in a van with a nice laminated card that looks professional, but they're not doing the job correctly. And this bill addresses some of that. It brings some accountability, because we have so many companies in this great state that are doing it right and are doing it correctly, and are treating these situations with professionalism, and they're living up to their fiduciary responsibility. So this bill is going to clean some of that up for us, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Any other questions from any of the committee members? Is there anyone, even though this bill was heard this morning in committee, is there anyone here that wishes to be heard, either for or against? We have the Sheriff's Association who wishes to come up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If you would, come up to the podium and identify yourself.
I'm afraid I'm highly identifiable in this environment, but my name is Terry Norris. I'm the Executive Director of the Sheriff's Association. I am not here to oppose the chairman's bill, but we do have one concern, and our concern is accessibility. And will this limit the number of groups that can respond to a trauma scene? And if it can, does that mean that our deputies and our police officers are going to be standing at that scene longer? Because as you all know, we're down in numbers locally, and we're pretty well strapped. So, I mean, if we can somehow get comfortable with that aspect, that, you know, within a reasonable time, no matter where you are in the state, if you're going to ask for some company to do this for hire, then they can be there. But we are truly concerned about getting deputies back on the road. And other than that, you know, everything that's been said is, you did a really good job of explaining that. That is not a polite, there's no polite way to talk about trauma scenes. And there are issues out there, and trauma scenes further traumatize those victimized. So with that said, Mr. Chairman, just any thoughts that the committee could have, and recognizing that one aspect, we appreciate it.
I'll give you my answer to my thoughts on this, Terry. Currently, they tell me, and nobody really knows how many people are out there that are doing this type of service, but apparently there must be a pretty good many of them. I've been told there was 50, at least 50 has been identified. So, you know, I don't think that this is, I don't think that anything is going to limit the current number of folks that are doing this. Secondly, as far as deputies being on the crime scene, I don't know the justification of that that's going to hold them up, because there's usually not a cleanup until after the officers have performed their investigation and then they leave. I don't think anybody's allowed to go into a crime scene, an active investigation of a crime scene.
No, sir, you're correct about that, but if there's a trauma scene in which a deputy sheriff responds, or a crime scene in which they're there, even after the investigation is over, most of the time, the deputy's gonna stay there until the family can get somebody in there to start working on the scene. And it's a courtesy as much as it is anything else. No, they could just leave, but most of them are not. So, and we kind of liken it, and it's probably not on point, but we're kind of liking it to meth lab cleanups, when we have to wait on a certain group that can come in and clean up meth labs. We know we have to stay there, and we do know it's a little different in terms of the materials that are there and the drugs that are there. But that waiting at the scene is somewhat problematic. So just for your consideration, we appreciate it. Any questions, I'll be glad to answer.
Any questions from the committee members?
Thank you all.
Thank you, Terry.
Yes, sir.
We have a hand in the back. Mr. Williams, representative.
Yes, sir. I'd like to address that. I'm sorry I wasn't here to hear some of the other discussion, and I echo your sentiments. I've been in the funeral business about 45 years and seen many bad situations, suicide, murder. A lot of times you'll see unlicensed people or Mary's home cleanup service show up, like Representative Collins said. You'll have some people who, and it's not necessary that the deputies stay to keep the scene, and I understand them wanting to, because we have a great sheriff in Baldwin County, Bill Massey, and he and his men do a superb job. But for instance, one suicide in a residence just a couple of years ago. It was very messy. We were able to just close the door off. We removed the remains, and the family, of course, was distraught, but they got on the phone trying to call. And this has been some years ago, before some of the professionals come along. But they got on the phone trying to call, and the sheriff didn't know, or the deputies didn't know exactly, or it was the city police didn't know exactly who to refer them to. So they had, what's the name of the people who advertise as if it never happened?
ServPro.
ServPro shows up. I don't know that ServPro actually needed to be there. This could have been HIV positive, hepatitis. There's so many things that will be in the body fluids that are left behind. But I have seen, situations for many, many years, and I don't want to create a bureaucracy, but I want to create something professional. And as one person put it to me earlier today, if Grandpa goes out on the back porch and commits suicide, and there's blood and stuff on the back porch, then what's to prevent the son or son-in-law from going out with the water hose and washing the back porch down? That should be, that's totally different. But what you have is where this guy did a double-aught buck 12-gauge shotgun, just created very bad. And I just wanted to put my 2 cents in. I did not hear some of the other discussion, and I hope I haven't been redundant. But I approve of it because there's got to be some regulation in all of this. And this is what I've been pushing for, whether it's just body transport or people showing up to clean up. And there's no regulation on them advertising. And I'll be glad to take any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Thank you.
If anybody has any questions for me.
Any questions of the committee members?
Thank you for the opportunity to
Thank
speak.
you. Do we have a third member of the Funeral Home Caucus here that wants to speak today? Good, solid group. All right. Is there anyone else? Mr. Schneider.
Members of the committee, I spoke earlier about this bill in subcommittee, and I just wanted to address the issues that have just been brought up. As far as somebody taking care of their own cleanup, whether it's a relative or a friend, if you look on lines 150 to 151 of the bill, that addresses that. That is not covered, and there's no restriction in that occurring, so we did respect the property rights. As to the issue with the trauma scene, there's nothing in the bill that requires anybody from law enforcement to stay. I understand the courtesy and the sensitivity of them wanting to stay, but we're not putting an additional burden on the sheriffs or the police or anybody else to do that. This is a first step of having some sort of dignity and regulation, has been pointed out, to address this issue. And we would hope that you all would positively endorse this concept. At the end of the day, what we're wanting to make sure of is that the family is not re-victimized. After having a suicide, we don't want theft and things being stolen out of a house or anything like that. That's why we have the liability insurance and the bond. We're just asking for the owners of the company to go through a background check and making sure there's not a felony and they're fingerprinted. They are responsible for their own employees, and because of the things that could occur, I think that that's a very important requirement. At the end of the day, again, we are just registering these companies, entities like medical facilities or whatever that are regulated by OSHA, and the feds are not affected by this bill. So we would ask for your favorable support. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions of the committee?
Thank you.
I'd say we've just about talked this one to death then. All right, if there's no other questions and no one else wishes to be heard on this issue, what's the will of the committee? We have a motion. We have a second. Any further questions? Any comments? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? And the ayes clearly have it. I want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank the committee for being here today. Let me just take just a minute to give you the posture. I see we have some activists in the audience today. At some point this week, there's an issue that seems to have garnered an awful lot of interest amongst different quarters in the state, and those are Second Amendment right issues, carrier issues and such as that. We have a number of those bills that have been put in. We've got several more that will be put in. There'll be a subcommittee. It'll be Subcommittee 2A that will be formed to hear all of these bills. They may be coming together as early as this week, if not certainly by next week, so that all of those issues that are germane to that subject matter. Anyone wish to be heard today? Well, if not, I want to thank y'all for being in attendance. This meeting is convened. Oh, man, damn. Mind if I keep your lane?